us now, the political director of the Atlantic media company, Ron Brownstein, in a new piece for the National Journal. Ron explains why the Democrats may be losing ground in the Mountain West. He writes this: ominous for Democrats are signs that the independent voters who flocked to the party in 2006 and 2008 may be growing uneasy with the cost and sweep of Obama's plans. Asked what Congress could do to most strengthen his position heading into the 2010 election, a Democrat offered two ideas: pass a health care reform bill, quote, that's paid for, and then demonstrate a persuasive commitment to pay down our deficit and debt. Ron, good morning to you.
Good morning, Willie.
How big a problem is this for Democrats right now, these centrist Democrats who are concerned with deficits?
Well, let's climb up the hill before we climb down it, fittingly enough, for the Mountain States. The Mountain States have been one of the towering success stories for the Democrats in this decade, and they crystallize really the challenge the party is going to face in a lot of parts of the country in 2010. When the decade began, Republicans dominated the Mountain States. They had 13 of the 16 Senate seats, for example. But especially in Bush's second term, the Democrats have made steady and broad progress. They now hold most of the House seats in the 8 Mountain States, which is remarkable. They held a majority of the governorships after the 2008 election. They held 7 of the 16 Senate seats, and Obama won 3 of the states, Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico, and almost half of the total votes in the region. But these gains were made against the backdrop of Bush's presidency, and it was easier for Democrats to portray themselves as moderates in this and other swing parts of the country. I think of the outer South, places like Virginia, against the backdrop of a conservative Republican president. Now the Democrats are facing the challenge, particularly in the Mountain West, but you see it in Virginia this year, and I think you'll see it next year in Virginia and some of these other outer South states, North Carolina perhaps. Now they face the challenge of holding on to those centrist voters while advancing a national Democratic agenda. And that is a challenge in some of these areas that traditionally have been less receptive to an aggressive role for Washington in the economy. So this has really been a big success story for Democrats, and I was at a conference in August where they were very proud of their accomplishments, but it is a challenge now, because not only do you have this question of can you hold the independent voters who have moved their direction, these suburbanites, but also you have an undeniable mobilization of the conservative base, rural, white conservative base in these mountain states. It's very real, sort of dormant in Bush's second term, but it is stirring now.
Harold.
Good to see you, Ron. Harold Ford. Two quick questions. First, do you get a sense that the White House appreciates this political dynamic, this change you're referencing? And two, I get a sense from your analysis that many in the West, and for that matter other parts of the country, may believe now that President Obama owns the economy, that he owns some of the foreign policy issues. Did that play a role in your analysis? Did you get that sense from some of the voters and even from some of the Democratic candidates out West?
Well, the answer to your first question is the White House is very focused on these states. I mean, as you know, many Democrats view the Mountain West as the long-term replacement in electoral votes and in representation in Congress for their decline in the South. And the White House, I think, Jim Messina, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff, the former Chief of Staff for Max Baucus, made the public comment at the conference I was at that the White House has Montana and Arizona on the top of its target list for 2012. They would like to take a majority of the Mountain States, and they believe they have a chance to do that. The answer is on the economy, yes. I mean, I think that increasingly so. I mean, the West, unemployment is actually lower in the Mountain West than in other parts of the country, but foreclosure is very high. You have these states are urbanizing more than people recognize. In the 4 southwestern states, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, as well as Utah, 80% of the cumulative population lives in one big megalopolis, kind of radiating out of the major city, and that's where Democrats have made their gains. But those boom towns, and I'm sure we'll hear this from the trip in California with Joe and Mika, those boomtowns are the one suffering the most from foreclosure, and that's a real pressure, economic pressure on Democrats. But I think the challenge is mostly ideological now in this region.
Hey, Pat Buchanan, what does this sentiment that Ron's talking about right now mean for what Obama hopes to do on health care? If there is a sort of libertarian or small deficit sentiment out there, what does it mean for the president?
Well, I think one of the president's big problem is the attrition that he's running here, Willie, in all these areas that Ron is talking about. And Ron, let me ask you, let's take it demographically. Obama he got 13% of the vote was African American. It really came out strong for him in 2008. Young people did very, very well, not as well as expected. Those two seem to be dissipating, where the anger is really in the white middle class and the white working class that you see at these town hall meetings. They seem to be turning away from Obama. Do you see what Charlie Cook is talking about, that this might be sort of one of those tsunami elections like 66 or 74 or 94?
I don't think we're quite there yet, but what you're describing is a very real challenge for Democrats that in turn masks, I think, as we've talked about, a long-term challenge for Republicans. What you have with the Democrats now is what I've called a coalition of the ascendant. I mean, they are doing best among groups that are growing in society. Young people, non-white voters, 26% of the electorate nationally was non-white. Obama won 80% of that vote. First time more than a quarter of the vote was non-white. And college-educated white voters. And that's really been key in the mountain states. The growth of the Hispanic the growth of the Hispanic vote and the improving Democratic position among college-educated whites has been really the centerpiece of their gains. The risk for Democrats is that some of those groups, particularly the minority groups and the young people, drop off in a midterm election, and you are left with an electorate that is more blue-collar white. Obama only won 40% of non-college whites, and there's no question his standing is even weaker among those voters today. The risk so there is a real risk that the electorate tilts in that direction in 2010 as it did in 94. The electorate got much more conservative. Most of the movement in 94, by the way, was among non-college voters. That's the risk for Democrats in 2010. Those voters turn out. But the risk for Republicans is they mistake that for a winning coalition, because in a big national election like 2012, they still have the fundamental demographic problem of appealing to non-white and younger
Harold,
voters.
You point out the point. We've talked a little bit about taxes. It's pretty clear, talking to Tim Geithner last week, the administration doesn't have an answer yet on the tax increases that most people say are inevitable. You're saying that if they don't handle this right, particularly with those Bush tax cuts that the administration said they're going to roll back, that could be the key issue that causes a sweep for the Republicans.
It could be a big issue in it. I mean, I'd even want to hear Ron's point on this. If taxes are raised in this fragile moment that we find ourselves in,
right.
You know as well as I do, covering this, knowing it better than anybody on set here, the impact that will have on business. Too, the congressman that raised the biggest objection early on to the health care plan advanced by Democrats, which called for tax increases, was a young Colorado congressman, a former businessman himself, who sent the letter courageously to Speaker Pelosi saying, if you do this, I won't vote for it, and several House freshman Democrats will not vote for it. Raising taxes, and for that matter, the health care bill not being paid for, this could have a big effect on these 06 and 08 Democrats that won, not only in the West, but I would argue across the South as well.
Yeah. I wanted to get into one of our must-read op-eds real quick and get some reaction around the table from Charles Krauthammer this morning, the conservative columnist, of course, in the Washington Post, writing about President Obama's style with health care. Listen to what he says. Reacting to the Joe Wilson, you lie comment, he says, Krauthammer does, Obama doesn't lie, he merely elides, gliding from one dubious assertion to another. This has been the story throughout this whole health care crusade. Its original premise was that our current financial crisis was rooted in neglect of three things: energy, education, and health care. That transparent attempt to exploit what he calls Emmanuel's Law, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, failed for health care because no one is stupid enough to believe that the 2008 financial collapse was caused by a lack of universal health care. Obama doesn't lie. He implies, he misdirects, he misleads so fluidly and incessantly that he risks transmuting eloquence into mere slickness. Slickness wasn't fatal to Slick Willie Clinton because he possessed a winning, nearly irresistible charm. Obama's persona is more cool, distant, imperial. The charming scoundrel can get away with endless deception. The righteous redeemer cannot.
Yeah, well, there's one thing in there. I'm sure you all have a lot of political points there, but when he says health care is not central to the crisis, that's not actually true. Health care is central to the economic crisis, perhaps not to the plunge we had last fall, but I mean, the numbers are out there. 60% of businesses didn't give raises over the past few years because of health care. 30% of companies have laid people off because they couldn't afford health care. Premiums for small businesses are rising up to 30% a year. Health care is central to the crisis.
And 1 out of 2 every bankruptcies in households across the country is related to health care.
Exactly. So that assertion in the op-ed really is not true. Healthcare is central to this.
Ron, real quick before we go to break.
Real quick, if you're going to accuse someone of lying, you might try to be accurate yourself. Obama really has always made a two-step separation here. He said that those areas, energy, education, healthcare, are key to the long-term economic stability, what he's called the new foundation. I mean, I think the charge in Krauthammer's article is kind of misleading itself, which is a bad thing to do when you're accusing someone else of being misleading.